Hi everyone, I'm Ruth Ramsden-Carlser, one of the co-conveners of the Oxford Queer Studies Network. We're really delighted to be hosting this online conversation between Jay Bernard and Lola Olufemi. Jay Bernard is a writer, their practice is interdisciplinary, and much of what they do is rooted in archives and social history. Their debut collection, Surge, won the Ted Hughes Award in 2017, and they were named Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year in 2020. Surge was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Award, the T.S. Eliot Prize, Forward Prize for Best First Collection, Dylan Thomas Prize, RSL and Darkey Prize, John Pollard Foundation International Poetry Prize. Surge is based on the archives at the George Padmore Institute relating to the 1981 New Cross fire. Lola Olufemi is a Black feminist writer and Cream Stuart Hall Foundation researcher from London. Her work focuses on the uses of the feminist imagination and its relationship to cultural production, political demands, and futurity. She is author of Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, which was released in 2020, and Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, which is forthcoming from Hajar Press in 2021. She is a member of Bare Minimum, an interdisciplinary anti-work art collective. Jay and Lola's discussion will be followed by a Q&A. So for those of you joining us from home, please type your questions into the YouTube live chat at any point starting from now. I'm sure you're all as excited as I am to get started, so I'll hand straight over to Lola.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And thank you to the Oxford Queer Studies Network for giving us a platform to have this conversation. Jay, are you there? Just wait for them to put their camera and mic on. There they are. Yeah, so hello. I wanted to start, I think, by maybe just continuing the conversation that we were having before we started streaming, which was thinking about this moment, thinking about how this moment has shaped the work that you're doing, and thinking about the things that we miss. Like, what do you miss in the work that you're doing at the moment, or what do you miss about the world pre-pandemic?
Well, thank you so much to the Oxford Queer Studies Network and to you, Lola, and to everyone. It's nice to be here. We were kind of talking a little bit about it, and I realized that a lot of my conversations, in a lot of the conversations I'm having, I'm sort of trying to sort of understand myself and others and so on in this kind of new context. And a lot of the assumptions I think I made before just don't apply, right? And a lot of the kind of maybe the slightly more dystopian sides of this past year used to be sort of more theoretical in a way, not for everyone, but I think for a certain kind of, privileged, highly educated person living in London who has had access to all of the good stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like, in a way, this has been a time in which I've had to kind of like completely rethink and reimagine myself, what queerness is, what it is in relation to others, and so on. So, I mean, I'll be real. The thing I miss most is the pub. Nonetheless, I think the pub is an important social space, right? And like walking around and things like that, like I see how prior to the pandemic, queer spaces were disappearing, and now during it, I see that even those spaces that, we made queer, like just, the pub on the corner, like in Camberwell or, Tulse Hill or Brixton, whatever, now those spaces are disappearing as well. So it's this question of like, what is our existence going to look like? Where are we going to go? Like, where are the places in which we kind of enact, politics, our culture, our lives, our loves? Like, what is all of this going to look like, and are we just going to try and kind of recreate the same thing, or is this kind of period of hunger? I want someone else's sweat on my body. That's what I want, you know what I mean? Like, that's what we all want, but like it's become even more real now, like, how are you going to get that, and what will it mean to us, So all of these questions are kind of they're instead of being sort of theoretical, they become like super real. you know? I don't know if you feel the same.
Yeah, I definitely, I think there's something in there about what you're saying about relation, right? I think like when you say you miss the pub, when you say you desire someone else's body on yours, it's that thing of like trying to know yourself through other people, or making yourself in the presence of others, and others making themselves in your presence as well. And I think for me, that's been the major thing. I've realized that my life is really lived in service of others, and that's what grounds my political commitments. That's what makes me want to make or create. That's what makes me happiest. And I think obviously for loads of reasons, the pandemic has stolen that and so much more from so many. And I guess this is maybe connected to my second question, which is, how are you thinking about your work, not just as a poet, but as somebody alive and witnessing this moment? I was saying before that I watched the Terence Dixon documentary with James Baldwin, and there's a moment where he says, I'm aware that me and my loved ones could perish in the morning. And it's got me thinking about so many people who have died alone, abandoned by the state, abandoned by institutions, and what the role of the artist is in that scenario, not just as like passive bystander, but as somebody who is alive and also has that understanding that they and the ones that they love could perish in this political moment, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think for the first time, I've had a kind of personal loss in one of these kind of recent political moments. So I would say that I sort of came of age, in the sort of 2007 to 2010, when you had student demos, the beginning of austerity, financial crash, all of that stuff. But I personally was kind of inured from all that, because I was at university, you know what I mean? Like I didn't have any assets. There was nothing that I could really lose. I was young anyway. And in all of the crises since, I've been quite lucky, actually. I haven't suffered in quite the same way. This is the first time that I can say, oh, like literally members of my family have been killed by this crisis. Like they were old, sure, but they would not be dead if it wasn't for this pandemic, right? My granddad died in the first wave of the care home deaths, and he like so many others, it was like that, and no one's quite sure still like what happened during that period, you know what I mean? And then my grandma kind of died in a much less direct way, but nonetheless the lack of care that she received, just the confusion and just the general, like just the simple measures designed to protect social distancing and so on. A 95-year-old woman can't live if that's the case. In some ways they're like children, babies. They need that interaction, otherwise what's the point? So this is the first time where I can be like, oh, I actually have to like really sit down and contend with this. And we are people who are interested in politics and what's going on in society and social stuff, but there's a difference between that and literally there's a funeral program in my hand, right? And or I can't actually go to that funeral because I might infect someone, you know what I mean? Because I come from Plague Island, you know what I mean? Like I can't attend the funeral, and so I've experienced history now in I would say I've experienced its passing. I think that's been the most difficult and hard thing to reckon with. So when you say, like, as an artist, as a poet, as a writer, how do you contend with this stuff? To be completely honest with you, these things have started to separate a bit in my mind. I wouldn't say that it makes the most sense to try and come at this from the position of a writer, actually, as I am, as a poet, as someone who is principally creative. I mean, you can make those works, of course, and I've already written poems and I get to do nice things and talk on panels and all the rest of it, but there's a deeper reckoning that is happening, and I don't know what that is yet. And I don't know if thinking about it through a creative lens makes any sense. I don't know if that makes sense to you, you know what I mean? It's completely changed how I've thought about my practice and who I am in this world, you know?
No, I completely understand that. And I think that it's this question of what is practice, right? What does it mean to be creative in the face of kind of overwhelming like death and misery and alienation, right? Like it seems kind of redundant, and it seems an impossible question and almost an impossible position to be in, I guess. I'm thinking, I wanted to ask you then, I guess to come from that, thinking about the archive, right? So we've just talked about how we might contend with this moment, but in Serge, in your works, you've spoken about the archive and the forces of history. And I'm thinking a lot, like in my own work right now, about the grand narrative of history and how we elude and evade that, and how the grand narrative of history creates this story, obviously with major and minor characters, and some of us don't even appear in it. And so I'm interested in my own work about not being found by history. And I wanted to ask you about your approach to the archive in that respect. How do you eschew the authorized or official account of events? You know, how has the archive informed your work, and how are you haunting it? How is it haunting you?
Do you know what? Like, I think there's like a couple of things in there, isn't there? Like, and I suppose maybe the first thing for me is when we talk about history, when we talk about these grand narratives, I think there's also this sense of responsibility, right? And this sense of just how completely arbitrary and annoying it is to find yourself in this particular body, this particular time, this particular lineage, and you've just got to work it the fuck out. That's it, right? And so to me, that's kind of what it is. That's what I'm kind of learning and understanding about it. And you know, you read like Walter Benjamin, and you read Stuart Hall, and you read Sylvia Wynter, you read all these people and they talk about history, and you're like, okay, yeah. But then when it's in your heart, when you're like, oh shit, it changes. You see what I'm saying, right? So like the thing that's really the historical moment, I would say, that is I'm reckoning with the most is the Windrush, because so basically I'm just going to tell this in personal terms, but basically when my grandma died, right, I came back to London, like to, you know, sort stuff out and all the rest of it. And I went to the park and I was walking the dog, and I was just like, oh, suddenly it was like, there was a layer that had been like peeled off, you know, when like, you know, when you're like in your bedroom and it's nice and warm and someone opens the door and this draft comes in, I was like, I'm feeling the draft, because that generation and those people, their heroism and the narrative we have around that heroism in many ways cushioned us from the present, or cushioned me at least from the present, right? The Windrush generation, when you've got that kind of grand history and you know the sails are billowing and the wind, and they come across the ocean, and you know all of the like hallmarks of that story, suddenly I was like, they're dead. They're dead. For you, they're dead. So now what? Do you know what I'm saying? And that was a really, really hard thing to kind of reconcile, because even when I was doing Surge, even when I was writing Surge, I kept thinking to myself, there's something about this that feels weird, right? There's something about this that is both like important and great, but also, like you say, like redundant and kind of a bit like, it's over, it's done, you know what I mean? And I have to say, like, probably the most intense conversation I had when I was going through the archives in Surge was talking to the archivist, and it was just a casual chat, you know, and she was just kind of like, you know, what do you think about, you know, the mystery of the New Crossfire and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, well, I'm not really sure. Like, do you think that we'll ever find an answer? And she was like, I don't think we'll find an answer. And also, I don't think it matters if we do or we don't. She was like, I don't think anyone cares at this point in time. And I was like, damn. Because again, it's this thing of like, okay, nobody cares about what happened then, but yet we're kind of immersed in this. I don't want to call it a fiction, because I don't think it is a fiction, but we're kind of immersed in this strange activity of like, I would say, of like repeating and going back and finding out what happened and so on, and trying to work out what the truth is and who we are and what it means to be British and blah, 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 blah. But the reality is that the time has kind of moved on as well. And so I started to ask myself, like, what kind of, I don't want to say cowardice, but I'm going to use that word, cowardice, have I displayed in my constant revalorization of the Windrush? Like, what am I hiding from, you know? And what are we all hiding from sometimes when we're kind of diving into the archives? What kind of ideas are we constructing about what it is we're doing, you know, and the importance of what we're doing, you know, like, in order to be able to do it? You know what I mean? Like, and I think it's a really hard question to ask yourself, because it calls into question all of your motives, who you are, and what else is happening. Does that make any sense? Like, I don't know if you felt the same thing.
No, absolutely. I think it also calls into question your position in that story, that the state will tell itself, you know, about its history. I think it's important to think about the archive not obviously as this like static thing that we go into and delve into and explore. I think the thing about what the archivist said, in terms of people not really caring about that history, when you come from a history of violence, I think your instinct is to remedy that violence, to find that truth, to bring it, you know, to bring it into a light that you imagine it's never been in before. But I feel I completely get you in terms of how that becomes a cyclical thing where we're constantly, and it's tied into the kind of project of representation. It's like you want to be seen and seen and seen, and you want your pain to be recognized, but by who and for what purpose? And yeah, it throws into question so many things about your own complicity and how you are thinking about that history, what you do with that history, and how it bolsters the present, right? But also how it bolsters your perception of what will come as well. I feel like so much of our visions of the future are shaped by what we see in the past and how we imagine time should move, or how we imagine events should unfold. And in a way, I think the archive slows us down in that regard, or the gesture and the orientation towards the past, constantly looking back, kind of slows us down.
I just want to say though, like, sorry not to interrupt or anything, but I think I think you make a really interesting point there, and this is something that, you know, I've been trying to think about a lot, which is transmission, right? So part of, you know, I think in your interview with Sadia Hartman, you talked a little bit about the practice of healing. I think she mentioned something in there about practice of healing. Could have been someone else, maybe not. But anyway, the point is that, like, yeah, it is important that we do this, but we've also got to put that into perspective. And we've also got to think about it in the greater context of where is this going? How is this being transmitted? And the means, what are the means by which we kind of do that? Do you know what I mean? Like, how are we actually changing anybody's subjectivity through this work? So that's why the work can sometimes feel so inert, because you're like, well, this has been sitting here in a box for 35, 40 years, and yet there's this disconnect between the reality of this stuff, this material being here, and then the narratives you see outside in the media and what people seem to know. There's this rift between what there is to be known and knowledge, like how knowledge production, right? So that to me, I think, like, you know, what you were just saying just then, that to me is like that's the pinpoint, right? Like, that's the difficult, like, nub that I think we've got to reckon with this stuff.
And also what is sorry, the BBC. Fitting. What is also underpinning that? What are the grounds on which you do the work, for what purpose? I think a lot about commitment and how that brings us to the archive, how it takes us away from it, how it shapes our relationship to it, right? That the point through any kind of engagement is to change subjectivity, or is to bring about a shift in the way people are thinking or feeling, or their desires, and how they see themselves in the world, how they see others. To kind of move on, we were kind of talking before when we were putting these questions together about how you're thinking about Sylvia Wynter. And I was thinking about a recent interview that she did, where she talked about the virus and the centrality of language and art in structuring our existence, and the need to understand education as a kind of initiation into a world of symbols and descriptions, if we are to usher in that third event, if we are to fundamentally rewrite what we understand knowledge to be and look like, and how we think knowledge should be transmitted. So I'm interested in your ideas about the role of poetry in destroying that kind of master script, in rewriting, so that we might be able to actually look at archival material and not be limited or weighed down by this current temporal regime, by the kind of here and now, so that we might be able to, I don't know, get beyond how the language that structures this current moment, essentially. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, totally. It's a gigantic, huge question, right? Like, but I have to be honest, I don't think poetry is the thing. I don't think it's the thing that's gonna make a dent in this. And I'm not saying that's because it doesn't have power. I am saying that because I think there's a tendency among artists to feel guilt about the relative inefficacy of what they're doing versus the urgency of what's going on in the world, and to therefore blend the two together in this kind of strange way, and to sort of attempt to address the real world via the art, as though the art was the activism, you know what I mean? And I don't believe that. I don't believe that's true. For a very, very small percentage of people, I think, yeah, they're able to do that. They're able to come up with something that does that. But the vast majority, it makes so much more sense to just do your art and also do your activism. They're separate things, right? And I think then you move away from the kind of the strangeness of some of this stuff, you know what I mean? So I don't think I would approach it as like, through my poetry I feel like I can do this. I don't think that's true at all. But I would say that in terms of Sylvia Wynter in particular, like, what I love about her work and her ideas, yeah, is the language stuff, but also just the way that she was able to just show how meaning is made in Unsettling Coloniality, where essentially what she's saying is that we no longer project our understanding of the world onto the world, but we project it onto people, right? And so people now represent a kind of like how we believe the world is ordered. And so when people move, that's how things in the world move, right? And so you can see that why it's so unsettling for a certain, certain branches of our population when, for example, you see Black people moving into government, or you see Asian people doing really well in business, or you see migrants like coming in and working and thriving in the economy. There's a kind of set of ideas that I think are not just rooted in language, but rooted in like the codes, the underlying stuff about how we kind of literally make meaning in the world. And one thing I've noticed about the about the last year, well, actually really the last 4 years in particular, is how so much of so much of the language in the media in particular is dog whistle, it's code, and that's how racism operates, right? It's a code. But second, how so much of what is considered meaning is fixed, right? So if you think about some of the kind of the nationalism behind Brexit, what is that? Oh, it's like, we don't like the fact that other people have come to this country and changed it and done whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to imagine a time when none of these people were here, and we're going to say that's what Britishness is, specifically Englishness is, and so that's what we're going to say is meaningful, right? We're going to fix meaning, you know, as a single thing. And all of you people, you know, like all of you brown people, you queers, all you trans people, everybody, like blah blah blah, you weren't part of that. Therefore, you cannot have any meaning or any importance or any relevance to what Britishness is, right? And I think Sylvia Wynter's really helped me to kind of like see that, right? And to see the kind of insidious kind of workings of how this stuff kind of operates. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking in terms of that stuff.
I really want to echo what you were saying about poetry not being the work. I think there is this tendency, especially in a kind of mainstream environment, to push the artist who is, you know, otherwise apolitical into the center, because we imagine that art can speak to something universal in us, right? Like it's always attempting to get beyond difference to the real kind of core human issues, which are love, care, etc., etc. And I think so much about those people who are, you know, doing the work, who are challenging the state in incredibly dangerous ways, who don't want to be seen, who won't be writing about it in their books, who don't want to express it through their art, precisely because the work that they're doing challenges and puts them in danger, right? And that makes me think about opacity and the right to opacity. I've been like reading a lot of Glissant and thinking about, you know, how in order to be in solidarity with one another, to care for one another in meaningful ways, we don't actually have to get to the bottom of each other's nature. And I was wondering then, if you could speak to the poets or the artists' right to opacity, but also as somebody who is engaged politically in the world, in an environment where the state is ever, you know, encroaching into our lives, right? In an environment where we're being tracked in all of these new and inventive ways, what it means to reject and refuse that for the purpose of the work, and what it means to reject that in order to, I guess, challenge that mode of governance.
Oh, fully. And I mean, I really like the way you frame it, you know. I think the artist is often co-opted as a kind of milquetoast, kind of neutral sort of figure that no one can really argue with, you know. And as a result, I think criticism has suffered as well, you know what I mean? But in terms of the right to opacity, I think there's so many ways you could approach that, and maybe one of the ways I might approach that is just to think about who the work is for. One of the things I've really enjoyed actually about the last year has been the way people have been kind of just creating stuff, some of my friends anyway, and just sending it to each other. And just the kind of like, yeah, the emergence of all these like little zines and like little threads. And I've got so many documents open with people where we're just like almost like writing books, like, you know, 15, 20 pages of just text that we've written for each other, right? And I think there's something about that. There's something about communication that isn't mediated by 5 major platforms, you know, online. And that also isn't feeding a certain institution or whatever. That is incredibly important, and I think rejuvenating in many ways. I mean, I don't have any social media, which means I don't really exist. Sorry, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, which is fine. I don't mind not existing. It's cool. But it is amazing, like, to see the kinds of the narratives and the stories and whatever that are kind of going on, and what I end up, like my view, which it can often be distorted, or I feel like it's like not the, but you know what I mean? I'll be like, oh shit, I didn't even know what's happening. You know what I mean? Or like wow.
Everyone has to translate what's going on. It's like, did you see this? And you're like, no, obviously not.
No, I saw something completely different. You know what I mean? Like, but I think that's so important. I think we're losing that a little bit, a lot even. And I think the like it links back to transmission. It links back to what is transmitted, but it also links back to this thing that I just feel like I need to repeat over and over and over again, which is that it's not necessarily the content of it, of these certain platforms. It's the mechanisms, right? It's the mechanism by which I think is what Sylvia Winter's also getting at. Language is the mechanism by which things happen. The world, like the social world exists, right? And we're not powerful, and we're not empowered enough when it comes to the mechanisms by which, right? So that's kind of like one side of it. And then I guess the other side of that is there is an imperative to make yourself seen, right? If you don't exist, as I do not exist, it's almost rude of you. Like people take it personally, you know, and there's a sense in which that you're just a kind of a technophobe, or you know, you sort of this sort of highbrow snobbery or whatever, blah 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 blah, you know. And people will be, oh, but you can use these tools to like set up a protest and da da da. And I'm like, yes, but the vehicle is still moving, it's still feeding the beast. You know what I mean? So to me, that's the dilemma, right? In terms of opacity, like I don't exist, but the beast still eats. What do you do? You know, like, what do you do? And as we know, abstinence doesn't work, right? So there's got to be an alternative. But how do you come up with an alternative if you don't have the mechanisms by which you can actually like build something bigger and greater? It's this thing that just kind of goes round and round and round. So that's the way I think about opacity anyway. I think about it in terms of like, how can we literally move beyond the surveillance state that we are quite literally in? I don't know. No, I don't think poetry has an answer.
I think also it makes me think about the cyber feminists who are, you know, attempting to, in a very serious way, think about the mechanisms through which we exist, right? The mechanisms that make us legible, and kind of aiming for illegibility. And I think about those kinds of political projects, ones that are trying to mess up the order of things under capitalism, the order of things under this kind of machinery of exploitation that we live in. And yeah, I guess that leads me to ask a question specifically about queerness and about legibility, because I think that is connected to the conversation around opacity. I'm thinking about legibility not only in terms of having a body, of the experience of having a body and being read as in a certain way. I wondered, if you could speak to the creative dimensions of queerness in its illegibility, right? I see all of these mechanisms through which in public life, we want, again, to be seen, to be recognized, for things to be enshrined in a certain order in law, for us to gain rights through that specific route, which of course, in order to deal with the urgency of the moment, might sometimes be necessary. But I was wondering if you could speak to the kind of power or the fun or the experiments in illegibility that where your work has taken you, or just kind of like in general what illegibility might be able to offer us on our political projects.
Again, it's a huge one, right? I mean, personally, I work on BFI Flair, which is a huge, you know, queer film festival that happens every year, and it's the biggest one in Europe. But there's something funny about being a programmer, because on the one hand, you're very visible, like you're on the stage or whatever, and everyone, but in another way, you're kind of invisible, because most people don't really know what a programmer does, right? They're like, oh yeah, they did the introduction or whatever, but unless you're like into curation and the arts and stuff, like what a programmer does is not clear, it's not obvious. And I think just that little experience of being like a hyper queer in many ways, like I would say I was like, you know, there's like queer, very queer, and hyper queer. I'm definitely reaching the hyper queer bit. But then also like operating in this kind of like background kind of role, if you know what I mean. Like, and I think that that is kind of made real by operating within an institution, right? So I wouldn't say that there's something funny about being kind of like hyper legible within an institution and being nobody. You know what I mean? Like I walk through the BFI, the British Film Institute, and nobody knows who the fuck I am, right? And yet I also work within it and put things on screen and choose films and heavily and deeply associated with it. So there's something about that that I think is analogous to maybe how things feel for me politically, which is that I am deeply invested in this country, you know, in this society, and yet at the same time, there's a kind of a arm's length there, you know what I mean? And this is something that I really learned when I came. Okay, confession, I tried to become Belgian, all right? I tried to leave, didn't work. Shit did not work out. So I'm back here, and like that was a real steep learning curve. It was like, I had to confront some stuff. You know, I was like, do I want to be Belgian? I don't think I do. I love being British, but you know what I mean? So there's just this like kind of thing. So anyway, I digress slightly. But there is something about the kind of like the relationship between your own identity and how it's co-opted by an institution, and then the anonymity of being within an institution, and then the hyper-visibility that the institution uses, that to me does feel very relevant. And it's something that I've been turning over a lot kind of in my head over the last few years, especially in relation to just like trans rights, just like trying to sort of have a better conversation that isn't swallowed up by the kind of toxic lava of the internet.
Yeah, I think, especially thinking about that conversation in terms of what critical and radical feminists who are trying to steer the conversation away from TERFs are doing. I think, you know, trying to get back to what is expansive and fun about messing with categories. I think that's, you know, the kind of power of illegibility or what it might offer. Just as a tangent, I think also about the ways that, you know, online, you might not know this because you're not online, but there are lots of conversations happening about how young queer people in their teen years, you know, are coming up with loads of different ways of describing themselves, and that is throwing everybody off. They're creating all of these new categories for like gender and sexuality, and you know, more materialist people are kind of like, no, this is terrible. But I think it's so fun, because the second that you make, you know, 50 different very specific kind of categories for yourself, what you're communicating is that you can't be pinned down. No one can tell you what you are, right? And that's why you create such a long list to attempt to describe yourself. I feel like in a way it's the same project in a kind of circle. And so I think, you know, against a specific kind of narrative of visibility and one of queer life constantly enmeshed in violence and only born from violence, the playfulness needs to kind of be, I guess, gotten back. I don't know whether you as somebody who, you know, is queer, has been queer for a very long time, I wonder what your kind of thoughts and ideas are about playfulness and experimenting in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the stuff that I see on TikTok is genius, and I think why am I programming anything at a film festival? Like, just, it's all there, you know what I mean? Like, my time is done. But like you say, I think there's still value in like that kind of like, but still like, in terms of fun and playfulness, I don't think that ever went away. That is one of the joys of being queer, no? Like, absolutely. The dark humor, the weirdness, the silliness, the fact that you have to laugh, because if you didn't,
or else you cry.
Exactly, or else you cry. And also, there's a striving in queerness, isn't there, for a certain kind of something. Like, certainly when I first came out, was, you know, starting to kind of like work out kind of who I was. I remember I used to go on this thing called ginger beer back in the day. I don't know if you were alive then, Lola. I'm joking. I'm joking. I actually, Joe, I actually get pleasure from like pretending that I'm really old. I don't know why. But yeah, I used to go on ginger beer, which is basically a chat room, right? Where you'd go in as anyone. You just made up a name and went in. And I can remember just laughing my head off, like having so much fun in these chat rooms, because it was, everyone knew that it was a bit shit, it was a bit dingy, it was a bit seedy. You know, that you would, I remember once this woman came in and was like, "Hey everyone, I'm looking to go on a date," or whatever. Has anyone been to the Glass Bar? And I was like, "No, I haven't been either." And then she was like, "Cool, do you want to go?" And I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." So we're like, "That's a date then." And it was just like, all of the banter, just the silliness, the outrageousness. You know what I mean? Like, it was all. I don't think that will ever go away, and I think that's also just that's not even specifically queer, is it? That is just community life, you know. One of the things I've been trying to remember is that, you know, I come from a really specific community of people, and I've been trying to kind of rekindle my relationship with my parents in particular, and I'm just noticing how much emphasis I've put on queerness and how much theory has happened around opacity and illegibility. And yet, all along, I had these two parents who do not read the queerness. They don't read it. I am opaque to them. And the genius of their comic timing and their humor is out of this world, you know? So sometimes I think we try and invent these things when they were kind of there all along, and actually they are kind of part of what it means to be engaging with just other people, you know what I mean? I know that sounds a bit simplistic, but it's just kind of like hit me in that real way. I think before it was very theoretical, and now it's like, oh shit, like these people are really funny, you know, and they will take the absolute piss out of you in a way that you wouldn't dare actually in certain queer communities, because everyone is so PC now, you know. Yeah.
My last question before we go on to the Q&A is, I wanted to ask you about your work across disciplines, right? About an interdisciplinary approach or a transdisciplinary approach, and what that's meant practically for you, having a practice that is so wide and so varied. I think in this, most people maybe know you as a poet, but I wonder if you could speak to how the different elements of your work work together and how they're integrated, and whether that gives you, have you found that it's given you a certain kind of freedom artistically, or a power that might be wielded strategically within these institutions?
I think, to be honest with you, because I do dabble in so many different areas, but principally it's film and poetry. And to be honest with you, going backwards and forwards, doing all kinds of projects, there is the issue of the institution. There is the issue of like, what is the point of all of this? There is the issue of like, when, you know, health workers are getting a 1% pay rise, what does it mean for us to talk about the arts? Like, what does this mean? You know what I mean? I'm not saying that it isn't important, but I do think we've got to have some self-awareness, you know, in terms of what we're demanding and blah, blah, blah. But mainly the thing that I think has come out of it all is a kind of a question, which is, why do we continue to do things that we know are wrong? Right? And that is something that Ken Farrow, director of multiple films, but most recently Ultraviolence, talks about. It's like a key moment in that film, and I was just kind of like, that's the disconnect, or the weirdness I've been feeling as well, like the dilemma, right? Every time I go from one thing to another thing, I see more of the same issues, the same problem. The work itself can talk about all kinds of abstract, cool shit, but the production of the work and then the conditions that it's made in, and the economic imperative behind it and all of that stuff, it all leads back to the same question I have, which is, I know this is wrong, so why do I do it? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I feel like this might be a good space to kind of open it up to the Q&A and to see the kind of questions that people have. I've got a couple here. So one person says, I have found doing political art a good way of dealing with the current situation. Do the speakers feel that there are any forms of artistic activity that are particularly valuable at the moment? So I'll let you answer that.
I don't know. Any forms of political art or any forms of art?
Artistic activity that are particularly valuable at the moment.
I mean, I'm not sure, because it can all be valuable to different people. I mean, I've found attending poetry festivals to be amazing. Like lying in my bed and listening to like world-class poets, I was like, why didn't we think of this before? You know, those adverts that have come out about the KFC Doritos or whatever it is, KFC chips, and they're like, why didn't we think of this before? Or like coffee bags. I'm like, yes. So that but in terms of like, you know, a much more kind of like, I think it's always valuable insofar as it's valuable in the same way that making a clay pot is valuable, or having a garden is valuable, or your dog is valuable, right? But on a grander scale, I don't know. I don't know if I can speak to that personally. And what do you think, Lola?
I think this kind of links to a question that I was going to ask you earlier, which is at what point do artistic forms become dangerous? I think in the current moment, like everybody is really, I'm principally interested in art that is propaganda and art that is didactic. And I think there is a tendency to shy away from that art should speak to those kind of universal things that are somehow not framed by an argument or not framed by specific conditions. But for me, like, maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about it in terms of value, but I think that any art that is practically useful is that art that is used in service of others, used in service of movements. And I'm thinking, when thinking about poetry in that regard, I'm thinking about, you know, poets that have attempted to create effective shifts in people that cause them to act, right? But also people who were principally doing other kinds of work whilst they were writing.
Yeah.
That to me is the only meaningful way to think about those two things, right? Because the things that you make can never be abstracted from the environment in which they're created. So I think it's I think it's kind of linked to that. And I had this like Langston Hughes quote where it says, when poems stop talking about the moon and begin to mention poverty, trade unions, color lines and colonies, somebody tells the police. And I think it's that question of what is at stake, right? If your art leverages nothing, then I'm not really interested in speaking to any kind of political moment.
But I think this is the tension, isn't it? Because also a poem that is simply a remark on the passing of a feeling. One of my favorite poems I recite to myself all the time is Longings by C.P. Cavafy, and it's a poem that has become suddenly relevant in so many different contexts, right? So I remember after the Orlando shootings, I was saying it to myself and I was like, oh fuck, this is really relevant all of a sudden, like in a way that I would never have thought. So I do think that you're right in terms of the poet principally having another practice alongside the poetry makes sense, but I don't think the poem must be in service of anything other than itself, you know. That said, like, you know, I'm glad that you brought that up again, because one of the poem that I really wanted to reference in terms of like when does poetry become dangerous is that when it tunes into the deep present difficult question that if you genuinely ask yourself, like, suddenly your world collapses a little bit, right? You've got to put scaffolding in it. So like one of the poems that I was thinking about is this amazing poem called Atlas by Teresa Sigatoni. She's a Samoan poet. And one of the, can I just read? It's a little bit longer than what you read, but sorry?
Absolutely, read.
It's a little bit longer than what you read, but it's a devastating like little section. He goes, when people ask me where I'm from, what they want is to hear me speak of land. What they want is to know where I go once I leave here. The privilege that comes with assuming that home is just a destination and not the panic, not the constant migration that the panic gives birth to. What is it like to know that home is something that's waiting for you to return to it? What does it mean to belong to something that isn't sinking? What does it mean to belong to what is causing the flood? And I just think it's a brilliant section because it is both true to this thing of like homelessness, rootlessness, being uprooted, but it also asks us the question, what does it mean to belong to what is causing the flood? Because that's you and me.
An excellent question. Thank you so much for that. We've got another question here that says, how far do you feel illegibility can disrupt these big narratives of history and of the state? At a certain point, do you risk disappearing?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's why you've got to also be rethinking like the society that you're in, right? If you can disappear, what does that say about these structures? You know, so it is true. You do have to strike that balance. I think that's what makes it so difficult. It's like, where do you draw the line in these questions? Where do you draw the line in terms of like, I'll just use myself, but like I'm British, I'm Black British, I'm queer, and all the rest of it. I would like to see these like huge social changes and so on, and yet how much am I invested in the state? You know, not ideologically, not in terms of what I say, but in terms of actual practical behavior, like actually what we do. How much are we invested in these institutions? You know what I mean? And if we were to disappear within them, like, yeah, how much does our behavior? How much is our behavior about staying visible? You know what I mean? Within these things, and what would it mean for us to disappear within them? And also, like this thing of like disappearance is super interesting because I was talking to a friend of mine, and you know, they approach this question in a super interesting way because they're a philosopher, and they were saying, well, the thing is, you can't just leave, right? That's how we know we're not free, because we can't just get up and go. And that to me is one element of this question of opacity and legibility, right? If we were able to just be like, okay, screw this, let's go do something else over there and start up our own little civilization, we wouldn't be having this dilemma. But the fact is, we happen to live in the age of the nation state. So here we are. How much do we give? How much do we take? How much can we disappear? How much do we need to remain visible? It's a really difficult question, you know?
And it makes me think about, you know, nation, even though they seem kind of all-encompassing and overwhelming, and there is no way to express ourselves other than through the nation state, through the border, and all of these different things. And I think about what you to go back to what you were saying about what does it mean to belong to the flood. I think about like, you know, refusal, and how in the many ways whilst we're here we might show our lack of allegiance, you know, our laziness in that regard, when we're called up to defend or protect institutions, when we're constantly thinking about these questions of visibility as well. How do questions of allegiance shape our actions, essentially? a lot of other great questions, so I'll stop talking. Someone said, earlier you talked about the fact that different physical spaces are associated with different identities, and many of these are not currently available to us. Could you speak on how this has affected you? Do you anticipate more permanent shifts in how you exist in and relate to the world?
Well, I think it's affected us all in that nobody quite knows what to do once the Zoom call is over. Everyone's a bit like, now what, you know? And like, some people are super harsh in that they're like, okay, buy it out and then it's over. And I was saying to a friend of mine, like, I feel like we need to like have like new ideas of aftercare, because like I have been in an event and then suddenly it's just over and I'm just kind of like sat there by myself. Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, which is not something that previously you would have experienced after a reading necessarily. So obviously there's all of that, and I think that has made me think more deeply as well about the kinds of events that I attend, because I am part of a scene that actually is extremely exclusionary. Like there's plenty of disabled people who've been feeling this for time and have been saying so, and we haven't listened. So in that respect, I think, you know, we've really got to like rethink and reimagine how these new spaces come back. Nonetheless, I do think it's impacted me and affected me, but it's also made me really think about like what I want. And I've been thinking so much about the domestic space. And when by the domestic space, I mean house parties, and like why house parties are so amazing to me. Like I've always loved a good house party, precisely because you're kind of just in someone's yard, right? So there's an informality there, but there's an intimacy to it. There's an anonymity to it. Like you just wander in and you're just like, oh, someone's living someone else's life, you know? And then there's just this kind of like anarchy, right? So I used to love the club, but I have to say, in my old age, I'm just like, where's the bouncer eyeing me up, right? Giving me stink eye because I didn't blah 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 blah, telling me to get out of the smoking area. I'm like, fuck you, like fuck you. I'm getting all aggro. You know what I mean? Like I once went to this place that will not be named. Where like the guy was like, oh, you can't come in with your food, and I was like, what the fuck? I got like this big box of like food from a wedding, and he was like, oh, you can't come in with it. And I was like, why? What conceivable reason is there that I cannot just put this food in one of the little lockers and go about my business? Why? Like, why are you being paid to like harass me in this really specific, irritating way that you can see it's clearly got under my skin? I'm still upset about, right? I'm still upset. So anyway, there's just a way in which like those corporate spaces, I think, were reaching a breaking point for me. And now I'm like, okay, I will almost want to take it upon myself, because I'm also not like an organizer. Like I've never been someone who like leads the way, but I'm like, I want to take it upon myself to like make spaces now, you know, and make them the way that I want them, and to not allow that like slide into like everything. You have a wristband and a ticket and the police are there and you know what I mean? Like I hate that shit, and I think it needs to go. So yeah, that's kind of like one way in which it's kind of changed and affected.
It makes me think about the kind of the haptic dimension of like readings or events, right? I think about when I went to see you read at Gaze the Word, and how fun it was to be in that kind of like such an intimate setting, and then to like drink afterwards and to talk afterwards and to unpick the poems with other people, and to say and ask which poems, you know, did you relate to? What did you like about XYZ? And it makes me think about so much of the work is not actually the work itself, it's the relation to the work and the spaces that facilitate that relation to the work, right? Yeah, I think also
exactly.
You know, our world is forever changed kind of permanently, but what I don't think is changed is that desire for relation, right? It might just take a different form, and it might involve the creation of new spaces. It might, you know, it's tied to the economy in certain ways. It's tied to like, you know, all of these markets of feeling, blah blah blah. But yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about that, you know, the haptic kind of
completely. And it's also this thing of like new people, right? New blood. Like obviously everyone in the queer scene has slept with each other, we get that. Nonetheless, it is still nice to just go to an event and be like, oh, my ex is X, great. I haven't seen you in a while.
That's for like knowing yourself in relation to others, really. That's
exactly, like relations, you know.
Absolutely. Somebody has said, I wonder if you think the process of making art for the artist can be transformative politically/personally as opposed to the product, in light of the comments you made earlier about the uses of art. So maybe that person is thinking about what you said about the poet versus the poem. So if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely vital that you have a practice that is about the clarification of your ideas and the exploration of your inner world. I think without that, you're lost, really. And again, that's why I would say it has a social function. It's just not activism in that blunt sense. You know what I mean? I think it's a much more nuanced activity, which is why most, you know what I mean? Like most people who were into politics and were activists and leading the way also had a deep love of literature or maths or science or something like this. You know what I mean? Like I think about like famous examples, like John LaRose, for example, who led the Black People's Day of Action. We had the anniversary just the other day. Loved poetry and wrote poetry, right? He isn't principally known for that, but he's got books. And the same thing with Claudia Jones. Like I recently did a whole a conversation with an academic from the US about how Claudia Jones has this very small body of work, which is poems, you know, and she understood that giving a poem to her fellow person, you know, woman in jail, in prison, was an unbelievable act of kindness and recognition, you know what I mean? That made so much sense in that context. So yeah, when you see it that way, it is important that you do it. I'm not saying no one should be a poet. I'm just saying don't confuse that for actually acting in the world, you know, which I think can easily happen because so much of what we call criticality and so much of the aesthetics of political action and so on has been co-opted by institutions, you know, and you can very easily find yourself speaking solely back to that and never to the world itself. So yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I think I think it's really interesting that you bring up John LaRose and Claudia Jones, because I feel like, especially with Claudia Jones in her poems, that is where that is where we see another dimension to organizing or activism, right? I think we tend to think about it. We tend to think about activism or organizing in kind of hierarchical, especially in relation to the past in the UK, in a hierarchical way, right? That there were these key figures that led X, Y, Z. We don't see the tedium of it. We also don't see that kind of what's changed in the doing. And I'd read those poems and I think that there's something about them that feels queer in the sense that she's attempting to articulate her desire for a better world. And what better medium to do that through than through poetry, through, you know, another artistic form. There's something about what she's attempting to articulate in those poems that isn't necessarily seen or visible in the action, in the doing, in the party, you know, in the manifesto. And I think that's for me why I think, obviously, and I think you agree as well, there needs to be a kind of symbiotic relationship between the two, right? That one can't become more important or than the other. They have to be informed by one another in the way that, you know, theory and practice are always informed by one another as well.
Yeah, and they can't become one another either. Like, and I think that is the danger that we see, that art and politics, to put it bluntly, are becoming one another. I think that's extremely dangerous, you know.
There's a question here that says, I was wondering what the speakers think about the role of idleness in art creativity and whether this has changed during the pandemic. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Why does this feel, don't you sort of think and talk and enact this all the time? Isn't this your territory?
Idleness. You go first, and then I'll bounce off what you have to say.
I don't really think about idleness, and it's not an area that I have much to say on. Yes, I am idle and wanton and wayward and deserve nothing, but I don't know if I don't really. And the thing is, I know that this is a thing that people are talking about, so I can't really comment on it because I haven't really engaged with it. I've only ever engaged with it in a kind of self-flagellating.
Being lazy. I think the kind of, I guess, to build off of that, I think about idleness a lot, though I'm not often idle. I wish I had the space to be lazier than I honestly am. And I guess what you're kind of referring to in terms of people thinking about it is how people are thinking, I think, more and more publicly about work and about laziness and about not doing work and about refusal in that sense. And also, more broadly about what capitalism as a kind of dispossession machine does to us and what it does to our time, and the fact that we spend so much time working when we could be in love with each other, caring for one another, cooking for each other, laughing, etc. So I think for me, idleness, is being politicized, has always been politicized, because when you also think about who has the space and the energy and the time to make work, it is those who are in this cruel world allowed to be idle, whilst their idleness depends on the kind of exploitation of other people. And I think in order to get to a stage where we might actually talk about the fruitfulness of idleness or the fruitfulness of nothing, we have to change conditions so that, nobody's laziness is dependent on somebody else's work. But just in a more kind of general sense, yes, laziness, I love it. I love doing nothing so much.
But you know what? Like, I sort of feel like there's a weird repackaging of this idea, because I feel like this is sort of my life, and yet I sort of feel like there is still scorn. It's sort of people sort of still cast dispersion on my life, and that when you actually practice these things or don't practice these things, as the case may be, there's a kind of a weird critique. I'm talking from experience here, like a weird sort of annoyance with it because you're not trying to do it. I don't know. Maybe I'm talking around the house a bit too much here, but my experience of this is as someone who is, I make a living off staring into space. That's kind of what I have to do in order to produce anything. Sometimes I find the kind of neat packaging of that idea a bit strange. It's a bit off to me. Maybe that's just because I've never worked in an office. Well, I have, and I was terrible. But I've never had that kind of like busy lifestyle. You know what I mean? I've never like been situated for very long within an institution. And so to me, it seems like a very institutionalized call. Maybe I don't resonate with all that much. Yeah.
It's because you're doing it.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of like,
people want what they can't have.
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should wrap up soon, but I have loved this conversation so much. Thank you so much. You've really lifted my spirits. But I want to end on maybe, I don't know whether I asked, this question was probably answered at the beginning, but I'm really, really interested in what you're working on, if you can share anything, if you want to, if you're not working on anything. And we can kind of end there as a way to kind of round it out before I hand back to Ruth.
Do you know what, like everything we've talked about, mainly just I think that the root of much of what I'm thinking about now is this self examination thing. You used this word earlier, this thing of complicity is a big thing. I'm literally writing about complicity now, and how we can use it have more honest conversations about art and politics, especially now. So I've been thinking a lot about those things, and then just relations to institutions, giving up art, something I think about all the time, stuff like that. So yeah, those are the main things. Can I ask the same question of you?
Yes, you can. I'm working on this kind of, I guess, book called Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, and it is kind of, it touches on what we have been talking about. So basically, experiments in imagining. So those look like 1,000,001 different things, and I'm trying very hard not to box myself into definitions, right? I'm not trying to give an overview of the future or an overview of what imagining otherwise as a process looks like. I'm just trying to use that as an umbrella to like have fun and experiment with loads of different kind of forms and ideas, and think about, particularly I think the thing that marks the whole book is political commitment and the sincerity of a specific desire for another world, and how that might be.
We should keep talking. We should just keep talking.
But thank you so much, Jay. This has been so wonderful. And now I'm gonna hand back to Ruth, who should come on the screen at some point. So thank you everyone also for listening. We're gonna go.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, Lola.
I just have a few thank yous to make before we say goodbye. Thank you to all of you for joining us and for submitting your questions for Lola and Jay. Thank you to Torch for making this event possible, and especially to Sarah and Maya for supporting behind the scenes this evening. But most of all, thank you so much to you, Lola and Jay, for so generously sharing your thinking with us this evening. It's a really great Tuesday evening in lockdown. I mean, even for like a normal evening out of lockdown, that was amazing. Both of your writing means so much to me personally, and I'm sure that so many of us who are here tonight feel the same way. So I just wish we were doing this in person so that we could now all go for a nice sweaty drink together. But I am really grateful that we could at least do this online. So thank you. And sadly, I have to say goodbye to you all now.